Hello and welcome to the 18th in my series of presentations on the conflict between science and creationism. Today I'm going to be talking about the subject of fish and other aquatic animals and what they can tell us about the process of evolution, with particular emphasis on the young Earth creationist claim of a global flood. In particular, in this presentation I'll be looking at a number of claims made in the presentations of the infamous young Earth creationist Kent Hovind. This means that I won't be covering the whole topic and I won't even be covering it in any sensible order. I'll just cover the topics that Hovind himself mentions. So let's get started. A common question about the alleged biblical flood, that Hovind claims to be a real event rather than a mythological story, is to ask what happened to the fish. It seems like a daft question because surely all the fish would be the ones to survive. After all, more water isn't a problem for them. However, it's worth considering what happens when you dump a few miles of fresh water into the saltwater oceans. What happens to the fish that are adapted to cope with a certain specific salinity or level of salt in the water? The answer is, of course, that they die. Why is that? Well, the salinity of water is very important for those creatures that live in it. Some are able to cope with large changes in that salinity and others are not. When we, as humans, eat lots of salty food, we immediately feel thirsty and tend to drink a lot more. Well, that's because the salt in our bloodstream is more concentrated than the salt in our cells, so the body tries to keep this in balance. In order to dilute the salt in the bloodstream, water is removed from our cells, dehydrating us. Of course, the same thing happens to fish if the salinity in their environment is changed. So this happens to freshwater fish, which will suddenly be swimming around in one giant ocean of much higher salinity than the fresh water that they're used to. It will also happen to those oceanic fish, which will have to adapt to a much more dilute salt content than they're used to. Both kinds will die unless they're able to adapt, and only very few species can do this. For example, salmon, which generally live in the ocean but move to rivers to spawn every year. Most other fish are not able to adapt. Creationists need to come up with a very good explanation for this. A global flood mixing together all salt water and fresh water on Earth would have killed almost all marine creatures, except for those very few estimated at 2% of the total number of species which can adapt, such as salmon, as I mentioned, and also eels. So we've established that dumping a huge amount of fresh water in the oceans would kill off a large majority of saltwater fish. But what about the other inhabitants of the oceans? Well, a large depth of water could cause all sorts of problems for corals too. Even if the change in salinity somehow failed to kill them, they would have a far greater threat. As they can't move, the water pouring down from above would massively increase the distance between them and the surface, and hence would block off essentially all light. At the bottom of the ocean, several miles deep, it is utterly dark, and only specially adapted creatures can survive there. However, corals are fascinating creatures because they depend on their energy on a kind of photosynthetic algae called zooxanthellae. The types of corals that build coral reefs depend on these organisms for the overwhelming majority of their energy input. But without sunlight, the zooxanthellae will die out, and hence the corals will die too, and rapidly. So even if corals survive the flood itself, and if they could survive the crushing pressures and the cold of being buried under miles of water, they would still be doomed because they would get no energy whatsoever from their symbiotic bacteria. So it would be impossible for corals to survive such a flood. But yet we know that corals take an extraordinarily long time to grow, and they spread very slowly. Corals found in different locations around the globe are often specific to that one region, and it's simply absurd to suggest that the coral reefs that we see around the world today could possibly have formed in the last 4,000 years. Massive corals are observed to grow at a rate of at most a few centimetres per year in ideal conditions, and of course conditions aren't always ideal. In addition, the actual reef will grow more slowly than this, because the effects of erosion and of storm damage and so on are continually working to reduce the size of the reef. Compare this with the fact that some reefs are up to a mile thick. Some corals can grow much faster than the values I stated earlier, perhaps 50 times faster, but not all coral can. We can study how accurate our growth rate estimates are by looking at the growth rings in the coral, just as we can do for a tree. In fact, studies show that the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, for example, is roughly 500,000 years old, relatively young for a coral reef. Its current structure is probably only 8,000 years old, but it's growing on top of far older structures below. The Eniwetok Reef in the Marshall Islands, also in the Pacific, has been estimated at an age of roughly 40 million years. As I'm sure you're aware, despite the fact that they spend their entire lives in the oceans, whales are actually mammals. Dolphins are another type of whale, and they therefore are mammals too. The thing about mammals is that they require air to breathe. Fish also require oxygen, of course, but they get theirs directly from the water through their gills. Mammals don't have gills, and so whenever whales or dolphins require more oxygen, they have to come up to the surface to take a breath. Yet they never spend a single second of their life on dry land. Why on earth would a designer set them up like this? Having to get up to the surface for air on a regular basis makes whales vulnerable to hunters in whaling ships, as well as their more natural enemies such as killer whales, which often attempt to force young whales to stay underwater for extended periods of time in the hope of suffocating them, at which point the helpless mother is forced to abandon her dying child to the predators. Making wholly aquatic mammals doesn't make sense to me as an intelligent design decision. Of course, as with so much of the real world, it doesn't make sense as a design decision, but it makes perfect sense in the light of purely natural processes such as evolution driven by natural selection. Whales are related to the rest of us mammals, and they evolved from land-dwelling ancestors in the last 60 million years. In fact, if you go back to my presentation on fossils, you'll see a long list of transitional fossils detailing the ancestry of modern baleen whales from land-dwelling quadrupeds, through amphibious mammals right the way to the majestic creatures we see in our oceans today. Well, that's all for now. As ever, there's loads more information on my website at frame.net, where you can also find a transcript of this talk and the following ones and all the previous ones, and you can keep up to date with my blog as well as learning about some of my other work. See you next time when I'll be talking about the study of populations, of population growth and genetic studies which help us to trace our evolutionary heritage. Thanks for listening.